Clint Mercer had ridden fence lines in sleet and stampede, but nothing stopped his heart the way this pale apparition did. At dawn's first glimmer, he found Haran, ivory-skinned girl of 18, lashed to his cedar rails, frost clinging to white lashes like candle ash. The rope had gouged crimson rings into her wrists. Her torn calico dress fluttered against a body so fragile it seemed carved from moonlight. For one breathless moment, Clint feared she was already dead. Another ghost the prairie kept, yet a quiver at her throat proved otherwise. He sliced the knots with shaking hands, and the girl collapsed into the snow-dusted sage, whispering a name that would haunt him, Lilah. In her colorless eyes he saw terror so deep it mirrored scars he'd buried since boyhood. 20 years of solitude ended in a heartbeat, and as the wind carried distant hoofbeats across the flats, Clint sensed the evil that abandoned her wasn't finished yet, it was on its way back. Clint carried Lilah across the yard. As dawn brightened to a hard Wyoming glare, every step jarring memories he'd spent 2 decades burying. Inside the cabin, he laid her on a cot beside the iron stove and stoked a reluctant fire, hands trembling more than the kindling. When the first tongue of flame licked cedar, he turned to find her sitting upright back, pressed to the wall, knees drawn tight beneath the shredded calico. Even in the amber light, her albinism shone uncanny. Skin the tone of alabaster marble, hair silver, white, and tangled, irises. So pale they flickered, rose in the firelight. "Water first," he said, keeping his voice low like coaxing a spooked mare. He set a tin cup on the blanket between them and stepped back. Lilah's gaze flicked to the cup, then to Clint's scarred knuckles, reading histories there. After a silent deliberation, she reached fingers shaking. Wrist burns Vividan drank in small ragged sips. Clint saw the bruises on her forearms, some fresh purple, some fading yellow, a cruel constellation any frontline medic would recognize. "Who did that?" he asked, softer still. A tremor crossed her face. For a moment he thought she'd bolt. Instead, she looked past him, eyes fixing on a shadow that wasn't there. "My stepfather," she whispered, voice hoarse as wind through sage. "Thomas Vane," she swallowed. "I was collateral." The word dropped like a stone in still water. Clint's throat tightened. He knew about collateral. Every scar across his shoulders told the same story. Collateral to who? He pressed, but gently, like easing a splinter from flesh. Her fingers knitted in the blanket. "Magnus Develin," she said, almost a hiss, as though the syllables tasted of rust. "Thomas owed him more than he could ever pay, so he offered me instead, said my condition made me rare stock." Her white lashes fluttered with shame. "But Develin wanted perfect. When he saw the bruises, he said I was damaged." Clint felt a hot flare of rage, but he kept it banked behind steady breath. "So, Vane tied you up here? Figured wolves would erase the evidence?" Lilah nodded. "He said it looked like I ran off and froze." Her voice cracked. "I believed him until I heard your knife cut the rope." Clint crouched, careful not to crowd her. "Listen, Lilah, what that man tried to do ends here. No one sells you again." He paused, forcing steel into his promise. "Not while I draw breath." For the first time her gaze held his without flinching, and something fragile flickered hope, or at least the possibility of it. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, carrying the distant thrum of hooves. Clint's unease settled into certainty. The men who'd discarded her were jackals, and jackals always circled back to claim the kill. But this rancher, once broken, had just rediscovered the part of himself built to stand guard. Clint had just slotted another pine log into the stove when a low, rhythmic tremor shivered through the floorboard stew, heavy for wind, too steady for cattle. He eased to the window, parted the burlap curtain with a callous finger, and felt his pulse thump in time with the rising thunder of hooves. Across the pale December prairie, a smear of dust bled east to west, growing thicker every heartbeat. 3 riders, he calculated. Their silhouettes formed and reformed inside the haze like charcoal sketches being redrawn by an impatient hand. Years of war had taught him to read distance the way townfolk read newspapers. Those men were less than 3 miles out, cantering hard and using the arroyo to mask their approach until the last possible moment. He shut the curtain, crossed the single-room cabin in 3 strides, and knelt beside Lilah. She'd drunk half the water and drifted into an exhausted doze. But the tremor in the floor roused her before he could speak. Her rose-tinted eyes snapped open, wide with animal panic. Clint laid a steady hand on her shoulder. "Riders coming," he said, voice pitched calm, though adrenaline roared in his ears. 3 of 'em. Likely Thomas Vane and those hands he hired. Her breath hitched. "He won't ask nice," she whispered. Didn't figure he would. Clint rose and unlatched a cedar gun cabinet recessed behind the stovepipe. He withdrew his Winchester, a battered Colt Navy, and a canvas bandolier half full of 44 to 40s. Lilah's gaze tracked every movement as if memorizing the ritual of survival. Clint slung the bandolier over his shoulder, chambered around, and spoke without turning. "There's a root cellar trapdoor under that braided rug. Crawl in, pull the lid shut, bar it from the inside. If shooting starts, you stay put till I fetch you." She shook her head so fiercely that white hair fanned around her face. "If he takes you down first, he'll burn this place to smoke me out. I'm not hiding while you fight alone." A flicker of rueful admiration tugged Clint's mouth. "Stubborn as mule in a hailstorm," he murmured. He handed her the Colt, butt first. "Safety's half-cock, thumb back, squeeze gentle, only shoot if someone breaches the door." Her fingers, small, blistered, still tremoring, closed around the revolver. "You trust me?" "Haven't had reason not to yet." He glanced at the window. The dust plume had thickened, horse shapes now distinct, sun glinting off rifle steel. 2 minutes, maybe less, before they topped the last rise and spilled into the yard. He kicked over the heavy oak table, angling it into a chest-high barricade overlooking the doorway. From there, he could sight on any man fool enough to step on his porch. Lilah rose on unsteady legs, moved behind his improvised breastwork, and knelt with her back to the stove heat warming her spine, cold fear icing her veins. "He'll talk first," she whispered. "Thomas likes to savor the hurt." "That buys me seconds," Clint said, setting the Winchester's forearm on the tabletop groove he'd carved years ago for coyote patrol. He breathed slow, letting the sight settle, barrel pointing at the sun-bleached yard where the riders would appear. Outside, the drumbeat deepened, hooves pounding nearer until dust rattled off window glass. Clint felt the old switch flip inside him, the quiet click that meant every sense was now tuned to angles, shadows, wind drift. 20 years alone had dulled the edges, but not removed them. They came back honed and hungry. He spoke without looking at Lilah. "Remember, breathe, aim, squeeze, and no matter what words they sling, they don't own you." The cabin door creaked as wind pressed against the latch. Lilah answered in a steady whisper that surprised them both. "Nor you, Mr. Mercer." Then the hoofbeats skidded to a halt outside, and the prairie held its breath. The cabin door vibrated beneath a sharp rap-three, measured knocks that reeked of confidence, not courtesy. Clint stayed crouched behind the overturned table, the Winchester's front sight glinting like a tiny sun in the gloom. Through the cracked pane, he watched the riders dismount. Thomas Vane swung down first, thick-bodied and red-nosed, his oily grin widening when he spotted the fresh boot tracks leading from the fence to the porch. Flanking him were 2 lean pistoliers and trail dust dustersmen paid to speak with lead. One dragged a blood-slick cowhide bundle, the calf they had gutted as a calling card. Vane tipped his hat and raised his voice just enough to carry. "Morning, neighbor. Hate to drop by uninvited, but I reckon you have something that belongs to me." Inside, Lilah's breath hitched. Clint laid his free hand atop her steadying. Reassuring then rose just enough to peer over the tabletop. "Only thing inside this cabin is me, a pot of coffee, and the winter draft," he called back. "None of 'em for sale." Vane chuckled, mouth twisting around a cheroot. "Folks said you were friendly. I'm here for the girl white as snow, eyes like rose quartz, hard to miss." He gestured toward the calf carcass. "Devilin's patience is thinner than this hide, friend. Hand over the merchandise, and we won't add you to the tally." The word merchandise sliced through the room. Lilah stiffened, Colt trembling in her grip. Clint's voice dropped into a growl. "You tie a woman to my fence like bait and call her merchandise?" He levered around into the chamber loud, deliberate. "You forfeited any claim the moment that rope cut her skin." One hired gun tall. Lantern-jawed stepped forward, fingertips brushing his holster. Big talk for a hermit with no allies. "Careful," Clint warned. "Wind out here carries lead faster than gossip." He swung the Winchester's muzzle to a hairbreadth beside the man's boot and fired. Dust and pebbles spurted 10 inches high. The gunman leapt back, cursing. Vane's grin faltered, hand flicking to halt his men. Clint spoke into the stunned quiet. "Next shot, I don't miss. State your business plain." Vane's eyes cooled. "Young Lilah is collateral for a sizable poker debt I hold with Magnus Develin. Man's riding this way at sundown with twice the guns you see. You shelter her. You pit yourself against the biggest purse in 3 territories. I've seen bigger devils crawl out of shell craters," Clint said, "and they bled same as any man." Vane spat. "Devil or not, Develin wants her unblemished. But you," his gaze flicked to the smashed window, "you're blemish already. Don't drag her deeper." From behind the barricade, Lilah found her voice small but steady, echoing across the planked floor. "I choose who drags me, Thomas, and it won't be you." The stepfather's face blanched, fury worming through drink-puffed cheeks. "You got mouth now, girl? Shoulda stitched it, shut myself." He snatched a bullwhip coiled on his saddle, cracked it once so the cabin wall quivered with the strike. "Last chance, Mercer. Bring her out, or I flay you both before Develin even arrives." Clint eased the rifle against his shoulder, sights nesting square on Vane's sternum. "Raise that whip again, and I'll trade you a lead tip for every leather one." Outside, the hired guns shifted calculating angles, counting seconds. Inside, Clint whispered to Lilah, never taking eyes off the door. "Remember what I told you. Breathe, aim, squeeze. If they breach, you save the last round for the one wearing the widest smile." Vane took a single step toward the porch. The Winchester barked. A plank at his boot exploded, splinters slicing his trousers. He froze, whip drooping like a cut vine. "God almighty, Mercer." "Not God," Clint replied, racking another round. "Just a man done watching children pay old men's debts." Vane's bravado bled out with the dust swirling his boots. He backed away, hands raised half high. "Fine. We wait for Develin. He'll settle accounts." "Let him ride," Clint said, voice flat as winter earth. "Tell him the girl's debt got paid in Fulla's rope burns and frost." The 3 men remounted, retreating to the ridgeline to brood under a slate sky. As hoofbeats faded, Clint exhaled, muscles quivering from restraint rather than recoil. He turned to Lilah. Her Colt was still trained on the door, but her eyes shone with something fierce and new belief that a life tied to a fence could still be reclaimed. Outside, the prairie held its silence. Only the gutted calf swung in the breeze, a grim pendulum ticking down the hours until Magnus Develin's shadow would darken Clint Mercer's threshold. The rider's dust had barely settled before Clint latched the door, wedged a beam across it, and returned to the overturned table where Lilah crouched, Colt still trembling in her fist. Her courage a moment earlier now bled into shivers, as if the bullwhip's crack had ripped open memories deeper than rope or frost. Clint knelt, easing the revolver from her grip the way one unhands a live coal. "They're gone for now," he murmured, sliding the weapon back to her belt. "But you know there's more to this debt than cards and bruises. Tell me what's hiding behind Vane's bluster." Lilah's pale eyes flicked to the boarded window, tracking the ridge where the three horsemen waited like vultures on a fence line. She drew a breath that rattled in her chest. "The debt isn't Thomas's anymore," she said, voice barely above the stove's ticking iron. "It belongs to Magnus Develin." At the name, Clint felt an old, cold pulse of recognition. Develin controlled cattle routes, railheads, and judges from Cheyenne to Denver. His reached long enough that even recluses like Clint kept a weather eye. "Thomas gambled against Develin?" Clint asked, incredulous. "He's suicidal or stupid." Lilah shook her head. "Thomas is cruel, not stupid. He knew Develin wanted me." Her fingers traced the rope burns on her wrists, as though mapping scars into words. "Because of this," she tapped her albinism, bright skin, "and because I'm not just collateral, I'm his daughter." The sentence fell like a hammer in the small room. Clint's breath caught. "Develin's blood?" She nodded, and the fire threw copper glints in her snowy hair. "He abandoned Mother and me when I was 3, Sade. A girl like me would ruin his image. But last spring, his legitimate son died in a barroom brawl, and suddenly, a rare heir was worth fetching." She swallowed. "Thomas married Mother after that. He saw dollar signs. When Develin's men came to collect, Thomas offered me as payment, bragging he'd kept me pure. But when Develin inspected the merchandise, he noticed bruises Thomas left. He called me damaged stock and threatened to skin Thomas for spoiling the goods. That's when Thomas panicked, thought if I died out here, he could blame wolves and escape Develin's wrath. Anger seared Clint's rib cage hotter than shrapnel ever had. So, Develin's riding to reclaim what he threw away, and Thomas is trying to erase the evidence he ruined at first." Lilah's nod was a fragile crack of motion. "If Develin gets me back, he won't kill me. He'll polish me like a trophy proof his bloodline endures. And if Thomas takes me, he'll finish what he started so Develin can't." She met Clint's gaze, determination glinting through fear. "Either way, the prairie wins and I lose." Clint rose, shoulders squaring, the decision already soldered beneath his sternum. "We changed the odds," he said. He unrolled a faded territory map on the floorboards, finger tracing a zigzag toward the snow-choked passes of the Bighorns. "I fought Confederates with nothing but high ground and a day's rations. Fought my own demons with less. Develin thinks he owns every mile between here and Cheyenne, but mountains don't sign deeds." He looked up. "At dusk, he'll arrive expecting a business exchange. We'll give him an empty cabin and a trail he can't tame." Lilah studied him, voice a raw whisper. "Why risk your life for me?" Clint closed the map, eyes flaring with the hard light of a man reclaiming purpose. "Because no child of any devil deserves to be traded like cattle. And because 20 years ago, someone should have stood between me and the man who owned my flesh. Tonight, I'm that someone for you." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying distant hoofbeats from the plains, the herald of Magnus Develin. Inside, 2 fugitives sewn, scarred by the past, one branded by albinism, prepared to outrun a kingdom built on debt, blood, and a father's twisted claim. Clint settles cross-legged on the plank floor, the map still unfurled between them like a pact waiting for signatures, but Lilah's gaze never leaves the dancing stove flame. Its light flickers over her pallid features, painting bruises that are already there and some that live only in memory. Outside, a gust rattles loose snow from the eaves. Inside, silence congeals until the girl begins to speak, not in fearful bursts this time, but in the flat, practiced tone of someone dragging secrets into daylight before they can rot her alive. "Thomas never gambled to feed us," she says, thumbs worrying the frayed hem of her sleeve. He gambled because losing meant I owed him. A thin breath. Every chip he placed, every shot of rye he swallowed, that was a new bruise he'd collect for me later. She tugs the sleeve higher, revealing a ladder of faded lash marks. Clint's gut knots. He recognizes the spacing, the cruel efficiency. Most nights he used a belt, she continues, but when winter came, the leather froze stiff, so he switched to a willow rod. Less effort, he said. Her voice remains clinical, yet her fists clench until knuckles bleach whiter than her skin. Clint absorbs each word like shrapnel. The cabin's warmth feels suddenly stifling, as if the crimes she recounts smother the oxygen itself. He wants to comfort her, to place a hand on her shoulder, but instinct warns that pity can sting worse than a fresh welt. Instead, he steadies his breathing 4 counts in, 4 counts out the soldier's drill for facing cannon fire without flinching. Lilah's story spills on. She describes nights when Thomas sold moonshine to cowhands and let them jeer at her albinism like she was a carnival oddity. She tells Clint how Thomas's debts mounted, how Magnus Develin's name began sliding through the house like a rattlesnake first whispered, then shouted, finally worshipped. He said Develin was a man who knew the worth of rare things, she mutters, and that I'd fetch enough to put him in clover for life if I stayed unspoiled. Her lips twitch at the word. So the beatings got careful, only places a dress could hide. She pauses there, throat working, eyes fixed on the map where the inked line toward the bighorn snakes over imaginary ridges. Clint sees it happen-the-moment memory and present collide. Her shoulders hitch once, twice, then the dam breaks. A single sob escapes, raw and low, surprising her as much as him. She covers her mouth, ashamed, but Clint finds himself moving before thinking. He grips her wrist-gently, yet firmly, and leans close enough that she can count the sun-bleached freckles scattered across his albinous cheeks. "You're not shame," he says, voice pitched barely above embers crackle. "Every scar he carved proves his debt, not yours." The words taste like gun oil and truth. She studies him, searching for the lie Thomas always promised lurked behind kindness. Finding none, she exhales a trembling breath and lets her sleeve drop. Outside, a horse nickers on the ridge. Metal rings clink as Vane's men re-cinch saddles, restless in the rising wind. Danger tightens the air like the hush before lightning. Clint releases Lilah's wrist and scoops a pouch of navy beans from a shelf, spreading them across the map. "Each bean's a mile," he explains, arranging 5 between the cabin and a shallow ravine. "At nightfall, we'll ride here, then circle across Dead Man's Draw. Snow hides tracks. By dawn, we'll hit the old telegraph station steel walls. Spring water, good sight lines. From there, we climb into the bighorns. Develin's range ponies will founder on those passes." Lilah traces the bean trail with trembling fingertip. "What if they catch us before we reach the telegraph post?" "Then they meet a man who's already died once," Clint replies, tapping the puckered scar that peeks above his collar, "and a woman who refuses to die again." He hands her a stub of charcoal. "Mark any landmark you trust. Spring, arroyo, cave. We'll weave a route even the devil can't read." She hesitates, then circles a notch in the foothills. "There's an abandoned line shack here. Thomas made us camp nearby last summer." She glances up, a spark in her rose-flecked eyes. "I memorized every creek and choke point looking for escape. Seems I was mapping for tonight." Clint nods gratitude deeper than thank you. The wind howls, carrying Vane's drunken laughter, a reminder that the girl's tormentor still breathes beyond those logs. But inside the cabin, strategy replaces terror. As they shift beans across parchment and rehearse hand signals for the dark ride ahead, Lilah's voice grows steadier, Clint's spine straighter. In that flickering firelight, they forge something Thomas Vane and Magnus Develin never anticipated. an alliance between two souls tempered by trauma, willing to gamble everything on the one currency predators can't comprehend unbroken will. The map lay forgotten as dusk seeped through the cabin chinks, painting the pine walls the color of dried blood. Lilah had drifted into an uneasy doze beside the stove, her breath a soft rasp that rose and fell like a wounded bird's wing. Clint watched the rhythm, and with each exhale, a buried shard of his own history clawed closer to the surface. He'd planned to keep those memories locked behind scar tissue, yet the girl's story had splintered the seal. He eased onto the stool opposite her and tugged his shirt collar aside, revealing the lattice of whip wheels that crisscrossed his back and shoulder-pale ridges on paler skin, visible even in the half-light. For 20 years he'd let no soul see them, but ghosts demanded witnesses, and Lilah deserved to know who stood between her and dawn. He began in a voice so low it almost merged with the stove's sigh. At 15 he'd been Colton McAllister bright-eyed, too eager to please a father who liked whiskey more than work. One poker night, the old man lost everything except a resentful son. In lieu of coin, he handed Colton to a cattle baron named Ransom Crawford, scribbling an IOU on the back of a feed invoice. Crawford ran his outfit like a private kingdom. Bunkhouse doors were locked from the outside, branding irons doubled as discipline, and a boy's screams carried no farther than the cottonwoods lining the creek. For 2 years, Colton shoveled stables, mended fences, and learned that silence was the only armor weak men could afford. When he finally bolted under a moonless skyback, muscles laid raw from a quirth left his name in Crawford's dirt. Mercy was as rare as rain. Survival meant rebirth. So he became Clint Mercer, a drifter who trusted no one and spoke even less. He glanced at Lilah. She stirred, but her eyes stayed shut. "I swore I'd never belong to another man," he whispered, "nor let anyone under my roof who might chain me again." The confession tasted of rust yet. Saying it aloud loosened a decade of tension coiled in his spine. He rose and secured the shutters, mind replaying the night he escaped Crawford, feet blistered, lungs burning, every coyote howl reminding him that freedom and death often shared a doorway. He'd crossed 3 counties barefoot before a homesteader fed him cornbread and water without asking questions. That act of undeserved kindness had hummed like a buried wire through every year since sea, faint current still alive beneath scars. Now a different runaway lay on his cot, and her trembling echoed the boy he'd been. Clint fetched an oil lamp and set it beside her, its glow a meager promise against approaching darkness. He touched the Colt at her hip-making, sure the half-cock was seatoned, placed 3 extra cartridges beside her hand. She startled awake, eyes wide, then softened when she recognized him. "Training time," he said quietly. They moved to the doorframe, where he'd penciled a knot of charcoal on a distant fence post. Under his guidance, Lilah learned to breathe with the trigger, to let the front sight settle like a hawk on a rabbit. Her first shot sent the knot spinning into the sand. She gasped, half in shock, half in dawning power. Clint nodded once, a silent benediction. "You're no one's collateral," he told her. "You're a rifle with 1 round left hand, the will to choose its target." Outside, twilight deepened, carrying the cold scent of sage and destiny. Clint felt the past loosen its chokehold, replaced by a fierce paternal resolve he'd never imagined possible. Whatever demons rode with Magnus Develin tonight would find a changed man at this homestead. Not the silent drifter named Mercer, but the battered youth who refused to die in Crawford's Coroland, who now, at last, had something worth living loud for. Distant hoofbeats grew from a murmur to a stampede, just as the moon crested the ridgeline, frosting the prairie in silver. Clint and Lilah stood shoulder to shoulder behind the barricaded porch rail when the procession emerged. Magnus Develin astride a Cole, black Andalusian, flanked by 9 hired gunmen, and off to the side Thomas Vane, wrists bandaged where the rope crack had scored him earlier. Develin dismounted with the unhurried grace of a banker collecting interest, his tailored frock coat immaculately out of place among dust-stained pistols. He surveyed the bullet-pocked fence posts, the gutted calf, and finally the cabin windows glowing faintly behind Clint's silhouette. "Mr. Mercer," he called, voice as smooth as oiled hinges, "I admire a man who protects the weak, but you've tangled yourself in family business. Hand over my daughter, and we can part without further blood." "Your claim died the day you abandoned her," Clint replied, rifle steady on the porch rail. "She's no poker chip, no broodmare. She stays free." Develin's pale eyes narrowed, but his smile held. "Freedom is an illusion a poor man clings to. I offer legacy and I pay my debts." He gestured. One henchman tossed a bulging saddlebag onto the frost. Hard dirt, coins and banknotes spilled like entrails. "More wealth than you'll spend in 5 lifetimes. I've lived fine on solitude," Clint said. "Keep your silver." Thomas Vane edged forward, emboldened. "Boss, he's stalling. Let's finish." Develin's revolver flashed before the sentence ended. The shot punched Vane's shoulder and spun him to the ground. "You spoiled my blood," Develin said softly, the smoke curling from his barrel. "Speak again and I lower my aim." The moment froze. Clint sensed Lilah's breath hitch, saw her Colt rise a hair's width. He placed a calming palm on her arm. "Tell him, Lilah," he murmured. Her voice, frail yet ringing across the yard, carried the truth like a dagger. "Look at the bruises he put on. Meet the ones you called damage. They're Thomas Vane's doing." She yanked the collar of her coat aside. Moonlight revealed a necklace of old lash scars. "Your debtor beat your legacy half dead." For the first time, uncertainty clouded Develin's composure. He stared at the wounds as though they were ledger entries suddenly out of balance. A murmur rippled through his men. Numbers meant less when principle wavered. Develin holstered his pistol with deliberate slowness, then motioned a rider forward. The man produced 2 sticks of dynamite, fuses already trimmed. "I protect what's mine," Develin said, voice now brittle. "Come voluntarily, Lilah, or I blast that cabin to cinders." "Blow it," Clint challenged, thumb cocking the Winchester. "But you'll never know how deep Vane's rot goes. He bragged about sins you can't unhear." Develin hesitated, Digo grappling with dreadfuse sputtering in his fist. In that heartbeat Lilah's Colt cracked. The dynamite tumbled harmlessly into a snowbank. Chaos erupted, guns drawn, horses rearing. But Develin's men faltered, unwilling to fire while their employer stood exposed. Clint seized the pause. "You still have a choice, Develin. Be the father you weren't, or be the devil she fears." Moonlight glinted on the revolver shaking in Develin's hand. Then, with a bitter exhale, he lowered it, snapped at his riders to stand down, and tossed the still smoldering fuse into the dirt. "Take her," he muttered, voice hollow as the prairie wind, "and pray I never regret this mercy." He mounted, spurred his horse, and vanished into the silver dark, leaving Lilah's past bleeding in the snow and her future wide as the star-studded Wyoming sky. For one stunned heartbeat, the yard lay frozen dynamite hissing in the snow. Develin's pistol half raised, hired guns caught between orders and instinct. Then Clint vaulted the porch rail like a living avalanche, boots thudding across crusted ground. He slammed a shoulder into the startled gunman nearest the dynamite, sending both sprawling. Snow puffed sky high. Sparks arced dangerously close to the fuses. Clint's gloved hand found the sizzling cord, pinched it between thumb and forefinger, and snuffed the ember against wet earth. Relief lasted an instant, just long enough for a rifle crack to rip the air. A slug punched through Clint's coat, carving a bloody furrow across his ribs. Lilah's answering shot came so fast it sounded like the same report. Her Colt roared from the porch. The gunman who'd winged Clint dropped his Winchester, hand shattered at the wrist. Another mercenary pivoted, leveling a carbine toward Lilah's silhouette. She exhaled, just as Clint had taut-squeezed, and drilled the man's hat clean off his skull. Panic rippled through Develin's ranks. 2 shooters neutralized in as many breaths by the damaged stock they'd dismissed moments earlier. Clint staggered upright, blood seeping through his shirt, eyes blazing with the feral calm of a man who has nothing left to fear. He planted himself between Lilah and the surviving gunman. Winchester braced against his hip. "Anybody else want to wager against an albino pair?" he barked. The mercenaries wavered. Develin alone stepped forward, face ghost, pale in the moonlight. He stared at the blood darkening Clint's side, then at the Colt steady in his daughter's hand. "Magnus," Clint growled, "call your hounds off. You're outnumbered by will, if not by guns." Develin's jaw clenched. The offer of money lay scattered on the ground, bills fluttering like wounded birds. Pride, greed, and a dawning self-loathing battled across his features. He glanced to Thomas Vanistil groaning, shoulder slick with crimson, and seemed to grasp, perhaps for the first time, the rot he'd fertilized. Lilah lowered her weapon a fraction. "You can't buy me back," she said, voice steady despite the Colt's recoil trembling down her arm. "But you can choose what kind of man walks away tonight, the devil who sold a child, or the father who finally stopped." The words landed harder than lead. Develin's shoulders sagged. He holstered his pistol and raised a gloved fist. One by one the hired guns obeyed, weapons dangling or dropping into the snow. Silence swallowed the yard, broken only by Clint's ragged breathing and Vane's pained whimpers. Develin strode to his wounded debtor, eyes cold. "Thomas," he said, "debt settled in blood." He wrenched the man's revolver away and tossed it toward Clint's boots, then returned to face his daughter. "I failed you once," he admitted, voice rough. "Perhaps the only mercy I have left is distance." He pulled a thick envelope from his coat, heavy with deeds and bank drafts, and set it atop the snow-damp saddlebag. "Freedom money," he murmured, "for wherever the trail leads far from me." Lilah didn't reach for the cash. Instead, she watched Clint press a cloth to his wound, watched the way he refused to kneel despite pain. "We'll put it toward new land," she said finally, "and a telegraph to tell the world men like you can change, even if only once." Develin nodded a slight, broken gesture, then mounted his Andalusian. To his men he barked a single word: "Ride." Hooves thundered away, carrying greed, violence, and a father's regret into the starlit barrens. When the dust settled, Clint swayed. Lilah vaulted the rail, catching his arm before his knees buckled. "Easy, Pa," she whispered her first time using the word. He managed a blood-flecked grin. "Didn't think I'd hear that tonight." Together they limped toward the porch. Behind them, moonlight shone on a yard littered with discarded weapons, extinguished fuses, and scattered banknotes mute. Evidence that an 18-year-old girl, with skin like winter, and a rancher, scarred by summer suns, had just rewritten both their fates with powder, backbone, and a single unbreakable vow. Dawn bled pink across the Wyoming plains as Clint Mercer cinched the last lashing on the wagon. Vane's body lay buried beneath a lone cottonwood sermon. No stonewall, the empty calfskin and spent cartridges smoldered in a fire pit, their ashes rising like bad memories finally set free. Lilah stepped from the cabin clutching a battered ledger. The deeds, drafts, and banknotes Develin had thrown at the ground now represented a fresh start. Snow glimmered in her white hair, but she no longer shivered from fear. The Colt rode easy on her hip, a reminder that she could protect more than secrets. Clint hoisted himself to the driver's bench, bandaged clean and tight, and offered a hand up. "Colorado Front Range by spring," he said, voice rough yet hopeful. Lilah nodded, sliding beside him. Behind them the cabin door swung shut, but not in surrender inside. A new sign hung over the mantel: "No soul for sale." Clint flicked the reins. As the wagon rolled south, Wheel ruts stitched a promise across pristine snow. Scars may map where you've been, but they don't have to dictate where you're headed. Sometimes the world tries to brand us damaged, collateral, worthless. Yet value isn't set by those who wound us. It's revealed by those who stand up when everyone else rides away. Clint's scars and Lilah's albinism, once treated as liabilities, became the very proof that endurance outlives cruelty. Real strength is choosing compassion after pain has taught you every excuse for bitterness. And real redemption isn't a grand gesture. It's the daily decision to guard another heart as fiercely as your own. If even a man like Magnus Develin could take one step toward mercy, then the rest of us have no excuse to stay stuck in hatred's rut. Have you ever met someone who refused to let a painful past define their future or yours? Share that story below. Your words might be the rope someone else needs to climb free. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next tale of grit, grace, and second chances. And if this story stirred something in you, smash that like button. It keeps our campfire burning and these hard-won lessons riding to every corner of the frontier.